Hello, and welcome to the 72nd edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's pod is titled Europe's Negative Pricing Crisis and the Coming Solar Revenue Squeeze. Europe's renewable build-out has reached a sharper phase now. The industry can generate huge volumes of clean power, then watch prices collapse exactly when its assets are working hardest. Europe's renewable energy sector spent years fighting for scale. More solar panels, wind turbines, and megawatts. Faster permitting and bigger targets meant more ribbon cuttings beside fields of photovoltaic glass. Now, the industry has arrived at a very different pressure point. What happens when the electricity becomes so abundant at certain hours that nobody wants to pay for it? That question stopped being theoretical this spring. Across parts of Europe during April and May 2026, wholesale electricity markets started behaving like overstuffed warehouses. Midday solar production surged, demand stayed soft, and power prices fell below zero for hours at a time. Developers who spent the last 5 years celebrating generation records suddenly found themselves paying to stay online. That is a nasty turn for a sector still built around the idea that more clean electricity automatically produces better economics. There is a brutal irony sitting inside this story. Europe succeeded in deploying renewable energy at extraordinary speed, while grid reinforcement, storage infrastructure, interconnection capacity, and system flexibility moved at a slower, more political pace. The result is now visible during high solar periods. The physical system is being asked to absorb production volumes it was never properly prepared to manage, and the market is reacting like a market. France probably tells the story most clearly. Solar capture factors there have deteriorated sharply year on year, with midday oversupply becoming severe enough for negative pricing periods to appear routinely during strong solar conditions. The Netherlands has faced similar pressure. Germany keeps seeing violent intraday swings, and Spain has moved into the centre of the conversation after recent grid and balancing anxieties pushed energy system fragility into mainstream politics. For listeners outside the power sector, capture factor sounds like the sort of phrase invented after too much espresso near a Brussels conference hall. The concept is simple enough. It measures the average price earned by a generator relative to the wider market average. Solar generation floods the grid during the same daylight hours. As more solar capacity comes online, everybody generates simultaneously, so prices collapse exactly when the panels produce most strongly. That distinction is the commercial hinge. A solar farm can operate at high output and still earn poor revenue if much of its production lands inside negative price windows or heavily discounted trading periods. Investors know this already, and lenders definitely do. That is why merchant exposure conversations across Europe suddenly sound much more nervous than they did 18 months ago. The old renewable growth story was relatively clean. Build generation, connect generation, sell electricity, collect subsidy support, or secure long-term power purchase agreements, then smile beside the drone footage. The new story is messier and far more technical. Grid congestion, curtailment risk, cannibalization effects, balancing costs, capture price deterioration, co-location requirements, transmission bottlenecks, storage optimization, and intraday trading exposure are now part of the core commercial conversation. The transition has entered its infrastructure phase. Infrastructure arrives carrying invoices, and those invoices tend to land on developers, consumers, taxpayers, network operators, or all of them at once. For us at Synergy International, this shift is painful but healthy. Power systems were always going to become more operationally complicated as intermittent renewables gained larger market share, because physics eventually turns up to every sustainability conference, whether invited or ignored. The real surprise is how many policymakers behaved as though generation deployment alone would somehow complete the transition. Electricity systems do not work like social media follow accounts, where you keep stacking assets into the same network and hope stability sorts itself out later. Some governments still sound oddly detached from that reality. Public announcements continue focusing heavily on installed capacity targets because gigawatt numbers are politically attractive, easy to repeat in speeches, and much more photogenic than a grid connection queue. Nobody stands beside a newly commissioned substation and receives applause from journalists. Storage infrastructure rarely gets cinematic drone footage, and demand-side flexibility does not generate inspirational LinkedIn videos with orchestral music. Those duller pieces now carry the system. A modern, renewable heavy grid depends on batteries, dispatchable backup, fast balancing services, interconnection, smart demand response, industrial load shifting, electrified heating systems capable of dynamic consumption, digital grid management and transmission upgrades. Without that wider architecture, oversupply events become increasingly common. Europe already sees the pattern in real time. Midday electricity abundance collides with weak industrial demand, mild seasonal weather, and insufficient storage deployment. Wholesale prices crater for several hours, then solar production falls away during the evening ramp, and prices spike upward again. Cheap at lunch, expensive at dinner, with grid operators stuck managing the mess in between. There is an uncomfortable commercial truth here too. The renewable sector spent years marketing itself around permanently cheap electricity, and consumers heard that message clearly because politicians repeated it constantly. Highly renewable grids can still produce sharp volatility when flexibility infrastructure lags behind generation growth. Households rarely care whether volatility comes from gas shortages, solar oversupply, or balancing market dysfunction. They want functioning systems and manageable bills. Politically, volatility creates vulnerability. Fossil fuel advocates have started weaponizing these market distortions aggressively, and some of that criticism is opportunistic nonsense from people who would happily chain Europe permanently to imported hydrocarbons. Some criticism points toward genuine infrastructure failures that policymakers should have addressed earlier. Both versions now sit in the same debate, which makes the politics harder and the engineering more urgent. The renewable sector sometimes struggles to separate ideological attacks from legitimate operational concerns. That becomes dangerous because dismissing every criticism as anti-climate politics eventually blinds institutions to weaknesses that are already visible on the grid. Germany offers a useful example. For years, Germany pushed enormous renewable expansion while also managing industrial dependence, nuclear phase-outs, grid reinforcement delays, and difficult balancing dynamics. The country achieved remarkable deployment scale. It also accumulated structural tensions inside the power system that became harder to ignore as renewable penetration increased. Northern generation and southern industrial demand remain imperfectly connected. Transmission build-outs moved too slowly, public opposition complicated infrastructure expansion, industrial electricity prices became politically toxic, and gas dependency exploded into crisis after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Germany now sits inside a strange middle phase. Massive renewable generation capacity exists, while flexibility infrastructure still chases behind it, and policymakers try to hold together industrial competitiveness, decarbonisation, and grid stability at the same time. That balancing act gets harder every year. It also gets more expensive each time politicians delay the boring physical work and keep returning to headline-friendly capacity targets. Spain faces its own version of the same problem. The Iberian Peninsula has extraordinary renewable resource quality, especially for solar, and investors flooded toward the market accordingly. Yet, interconnection capacity between Spain and the wider European grid remains relatively constrained compared with Central European markets. When Spanish solar output surges during weak demand periods, there are fewer escape valves available for excess electricity, so prices collapse rapidly. Developers know this already. Some are integrating battery storage directly alongside solar assets. Others are pursuing hybridization strategies, combining multiple technologies, and some are trying to secure more sophisticated long-term offtake agreements with industrial buyers. A quieter category sits underneath those visible moves. Some projects no longer work financially under the assumptions used when they were first promoted, and that part rarely makes headlines. A few years ago, almost any renewable development with permits and grid access looked attractive. Cheap capital flooded the sector, ESG enthusiasm pushed valuations upward, and growth assumptions became extremely optimistic. Everybody projected electricity demand curves climbing smoothly into the future. Then interest rates rose, supply chain costs increased, grid connection queues expanded, permitting slowed again in parts of Europe, and capture prices deteriorated across several markets at the same time. Suddenly, the margin for error looked much thinner. That is why battery energy storage systems, or BESS, have become the hottest infrastructure conversation in European electricity markets. Storage changes the economics fast. Batteries soak up excess midday generation, then sell electricity back into the evening ramp when prices climb again, which turns price volatility from a threat into a trading opportunity. Simple idea, complicated execution. Battery economics depend heavily on cycling patterns, degradation rates, balancing market structures, grid fees, merchant risk exposure, and local regulatory frameworks. Different European countries still handle storage inconsistently. Revenue visibility remains imperfect in many markets, and financing structures continue evolving quickly as lenders learn how to underwrite assets that earn money from several services at once. The direction of travel looks clear. Standalone renewable generation increasingly struggles to command the same investor excitement it enjoyed during the earlier growth phase, while flexible infrastructure attracts premium attention because flexibility scarcity is becoming the defining market condition. This shift reaches far beyond Europe. The United States watches these developments closely, especially in California and Texas, where renewable penetration has already produced similar volatility patterns. Australia has dealt with comparable issues for years. Parts of China face their own curtailment pressures, and Gulf markets are preparing for similar dynamics as utility-scale solar expands aggressively. This is what happens when renewable deployment succeeds at scale. The conversation moves from raw, clean generation toward the system's ability to absorb, shift, and distribute that electricity efficiently. A different problem entirely. More technical, more capital-intensive, and far less forgiving of lazy policy sequencing. Another pressure point sits underneath the whole story. Electricity demand growth in Europe has failed to rise as quickly as policymakers expected. Industrial weakness across parts of the EU has softened power consumption, and Germany's economic stagnation has added weight to that trend. Slower electrification rollout adds another layer. Heat pump deployment has faced political backlash in some countries. Electric vehicle growth remains uneven, and heavy industry still struggles with high energy costs. Solar deployment kept advancing through those demand-side weaknesses. Europe built increasing renewable supply into relatively soft consumption during certain periods of the year, with shoulder months like April becoming especially vulnerable because temperatures remain mild while solar irradiance improves sharply. Strong generation, weak consumption, collapsing prices. There is dark humour buried in the situation. Europe spent years worrying about electricity scarcity and imported fuel dependence, then built a system that periodically drowns in solar power during daylight hours. Energy transitions rarely unfold in straight lines. For us at Synergy International, this moment exposes a wider institutional weakness inside European infrastructure planning. too many policy frameworks still operate in silos. Renewable generation policy sits in one department, industrial policy somewhere else, housing electrification in another corner, grid expansion in a different approval structure, and storage regulation in yet another queue. Then, officials act surprised when the physical system develops coordination problems. Electricity infrastructure requires integrated planning over decades, while Europe too often plans politically in election cycles. The grid does not care who won regional elections 6 months ago. Transformers still require upgrading, transmission corridors still require permitting, and industrial clusters still need reliable supply. Substations do not read press releases. They also do not become more capable because a minister has announced a new capacity target beside a branded lectern. One of the biggest shifts now happening across the market involves how lenders assess renewable projects. A few years ago, many financial models assumed relatively benign long-term power pricing environments with manageable volatility. Today, banks stress test merchant exposure much harder. Capture factor deterioration feeds directly into debt sizing, revenue assumptions face heavier scrutiny, and co-location with storage improves bankability in many situations. That means future renewable deployment could become more selective geographically. Projects located in heavily saturated solar zones with weak grid infrastructure may struggle commercially unless paired with storage or sophisticated offtake arrangements. Regions capable of absorbing flexible demand growth could become far more attractive. Industrial policy has moved from background noise to central planning logic in renewable investment decisions. If Europe wants to stabilize renewable heavy electricity systems, it needs large industrial electricity consumers operating close to generation hubs. Hydrogen production may help in some locations. Data centers will play a role. Electrified manufacturing has a part to play, and smart charging infrastructure can absorb power when markets are flooded. Flexible demand becomes economically valuable infrastructure in its own right. That phrase sounds dry, but it cuts directly into where future revenue will sit. This is where artificial intelligence unexpectedly enters the energy story. AI data centers require enormous electricity volumes, and Europe simultaneously wants digital competitiveness and renewable expansion. Those goals increasingly intersect. Data centers can create stable, long-term electricity demand growth in markets suffering midday oversupply, although they also intensify transmission pressures, cooling requirements, and local grid congestion. Nothing arrives cleanly inside energy systems anymore. Every solution drags 3 new engineering problems behind it, like shopping trolleys with broken wheels. Politically, Europe now faces an awkward communication challenge. For years, public messaging around renewables leaned heavily on simplicity. More solar meant cleaner energy, more wind meant lower emissions, and faster deployment meant progress. Those statements remain broadly true. Mature renewable systems, however, require harder conversations about balancing costs, infrastructure sequencing, market design, and operational flexibility. Politicians dislike complicated conversations because complicated conversations contain trade-offs. Trade-offs contain unhappy voters, planning disputes, higher network charges, and awkward questions about who pays. So governments keep selling simplified narratives long after systems become operationally complex. Markets are less sentimental, which is why wholesale electricity prices already reflect these tensions brutally and in real time. Investors adapt quickly when economics deteriorate. Developers change strategy, utilities reshape portfolios, and capital moves towards storage, flexibility, and dispatchable support infrastructure. The market correction has already started. The strategic question now is who captures value inside highly renewable electricity systems. Generation alone may no longer guarantee strong margins. Flexibility providers could become the real winners. Storage operators, advanced trading platforms, grid technology firms, dispatch optimization specialists, flexible industrial consumers, and companies capable of shifting demand dynamically around volatile pricing periods. The value chain is evolving fast. Frankly, some parts of the renewable industry still sound psychologically stuck in the earlier subsidy-era growth model, and that world is fading. The next phase rewards operational sophistication more than simple megawatt accumulation. Developers who can combine generation, storage, grid access, offtake discipline, and price optimization will look very different from developers still counting panels and hoping the market stays friendly. There is also a geopolitical angle here that Europe should take seriously. China dominates major sections of the solar manufacturing supply chain, and European developers imported vast quantities of cheap photovoltaic equipment during the deployment boom. That helped decarbonisation move faster. It also compressed margins across parts of the domestic manufacturing ecosystem and left Europe exposed to industrial dependency in one of the core technologies of its energy future. Now, Europe faces another challenge: ensuring the wider supporting infrastructure keeps pace. Cheap panels alone do not produce resilient energy systems. Grid reinforcement, domestic transformer capacity, power electronics, cybersecurity, balancing infrastructure, and skilled engineering labour all sit inside the same problem. Those pieces receive far less political glamour because they sound technical and expensive. Yet those are the pieces that determine whether high renewable systems operate smoothly or descend into recurring instability. Voters eventually notice instability, especially when electricity bills remain politically sensitive after the energy shock Europe experienced following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and now with the US war in Iraq. Public patience around energy policy has limits. Governments know this, utilities know it, and developers should know it too. That explains why several European countries are reconsidering parts of their energy strategies at the same time. France continues defending nuclear expansion alongside renewables, while Germany debates industrial competitiveness, anxieties almost daily. The UK is pushing harder into storage and market reform conversations. Spain wants stronger interconnection with the rest of Europe, and Italy is placing more attention on grid modernisation and flexibility investment. Everybody is wrestling with the same core problem from a different angle. How do you run highly renewable systems reliably, affordably, and competitively when generation can swamp the grid at midday and disappear into the evening ramp? The answers are hard, expensive, and deeply physical. They require steel, copper, planning consent, software, batteries, substations, interconnectors, control rooms, industrial customers, and regulators willing to design markets around real system behaviour. One thing looks increasingly obvious from where we sit at Synergy International. Europe's energy transition is entering a more technically honest phase. The slogans are thinning out, and commercial reality is back in the room. That is probably necessary if the transition is going to survive politically over the long term. Durable infrastructure systems cannot run forever on optimistic narratives disconnected from physical constraints. Eventually, markets force the conversation toward balancing, margins, grid physics, financing structures, and whether the system works on a wet Tuesday in February when demand spikes and generation falls away. That is where real energy systems live. Inside substations, balancing markets, transmission corridors, and dispatch centres filled with engineers staring at screens at 2 a.m. trying to keep frequencies stable. Those people understand electricity systems better than any slogan. The grid rewards preparation, punishes delay, and exposes weak planning very quickly once scale arrives. Europe achieved remarkable renewable deployment over the last decade. Genuine progress was made as emissions fell, coal generation was displaced, solar scaled rapidly, wind expanded, and fossil dependency started to loosen in important parts of the power mix. Now comes the harder phase. Europe must turn generation success into stable, long-term system performance, and that means flexibility, storage, grid intelligence, infrastructure coordination, and market structures capable of handling abundance without collapsing into instability. That is the real transition sitting in front of Europe now. Investors are already repositioning accordingly, and developers who read the signal early will be better placed than those still selling yesterday's capacity story. Well, that's a wrap on our 72nd GreenWave podcast episode. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. You can find the GreenWave podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Podbean, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. Follow the show, share the episodes with colleagues across the sector, and leave us a review if you enjoy the work we are doing. You can also follow Synergy International on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, or visit us directly at synergy-international.net. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.